Eileen. This is a kind of sort of classic moment. I graduated from art school in the 1970s, like 1969, early 70s. The time, the prevalent notion was that formalism was the highest form. I was trained as a minimalist painter. In other words, I was extremely capacitated to do field color studies, to create a formal dialogue that only maybe 5 other people could understand. I got a D in painting once. I did have my moment on this one. I got a D in painting for doing a figurative piece. I did go back and address my university, and my professor was there at the commencement for the arts. So I had my moment. But the most important story about this is that when my family had a big pachanga, they did it like a baptism. I was graduating, I was the first to graduate. And as we all came together, my grandmother sat and said to me in Spanish, she said, "So what is it that you do? What is, all this is happening, what do you do?" And so I handed her, I was very proud of this portfolio. I just submitted it, I received my graduate degree, and I handed it to my grandmother, and she started flipping through it. And she was very non-judgmental. I mean, she just looked at it, and she flipped through it. And then she looked up at me, and she said, "Well, what's it for?" And I think actually that was like the thing that set me on this path of trying to determine what it was for, what the art was for. And in a sense, I think I spent the first years unlearning what I had learned, trying to figure out how to make it relate to a civil rights movement that was in process, and trying to figure out how to make art that would matter to people that I knew. And I still like to tell people the story of taking my father along the Great Wall as him being the very first measure of whether I was getting it. And he was a factory worker all of his life, very poorly educated, never read a book except fishing books and things like that. And he would go along the wall, and I'd say, "Okay, Dad, what do you think about this?" And he'd go, "Oh, I remember that's FTR, and that's like when he made that fair housing, the rule for fair employment, and yeah, that really changed things in the factory, right?" And then I would know that I had actually made something that he could know and understand. So then I would bring my art friends along to see if they could see the references I'd made to other artists, and I would look at the layers of meaning within the work to see whether I was hitting them, one layer after the other. So really the point being, I had to unlearn what the university gave me. Yes?
I don't know if you've ever faced this, but I'm not Native American, but where I live and where I teach in North Carolina, I'm about 20 minutes from the Cherokee Reservation. And doing this kind of work, I think very often there are certain kind of iconographic expectations that come with the work. And with that, I'm saying, what's the work for? With the Cherokee, it's been a way for them to commercialize it.
Right.
And these images become certain tropes that are, confining and restrictive. If you haven't, experienced that in your public work, how can communities deal with that when their visual iconography has been so fixed that even the young people don't know how to get out of that or around it?
I think you have to make a distinction between, okay, if you're just talking about the particularly Native American iconography becoming fixed iconographic images that have a certain expectation, and that it comes out of really the commercialization, the sort of artifacts of indigenous people become important, really in a sense a historicized version of a people past, in a sense. So they're looking at those artifacts as being important things as commodities, right? They're sort of commodified. I have to make a distinction between that commodified iconography and also the people who make imagery, contemporary imagery today, that is religious imagery. For example, you take the Haidas of the Northwest, and the First Nation people in British Columbia, for example, along the Queen Charlotte's and along those island areas. Much of that imagery is imagery that is fixed, that it makes reference to certain animals and certain lives, because that actually is the whole constellation of religious practice. And that's a different thing. And actually artists have approached it in really exciting ways. And whales that, are magic when you see them in terms of the graphic representation, or the raven that is the creator figure. But the other is the commercialization. And it's what happens when the arts actually simply become about object making. And I think some of our colleagues have been talking about the hyper-corporatization of the arts, which I just love. And since I heard Dudley talk about it, I thought, this is such a wonderful way of describing what has happened. And think the whole shift that we are experiencing in the United States today to this sort of corporate power and control has also happened to the arts. And the fact is that when I'm working in communities, I'm not asking people what they want to see. I'm not saying, what is the image that I should paint? I'm saying, what do you care about? What are you thinking about? What is the story that you want to tell? And then I'm putting all the best minds together to come up with the imagery that is fresh, that is new, that might even include spray can art and hip-hop artists and other ways of applying it to their moment of time, and to make it real and alive. So I think actually if you're actually doing that job, it's going to be different each time. And for example, on in the news thing that has been happening is that you see within the Karasit image, you see people actually using first source material that normally would go into the boxes, into the archives, becoming part of the actual image making process. And we can actually modify those images, but it was very important for the people to use the actual image of the moment of disappearance, because those were their families and friends that were being taken away to never be seen again. So there's some possibilities that are really new and different than as we move into this next realm of technology and the making of large-scale images. Also, all of this work is archives. So not only have we made the work, but there's an archive behind each of them. And then those archives can be shared information with other people who are doing the recovery or doing stories of their own communities. Any other questions? Comments? I will tell that story, but let's see what you wanted to add first.
Judy, I just wanted to thank you for sharing some of your personal story with this, because I realize in a setting like this, and a lot of the people of color who are doing this type of work come from a place of struggle. And I think a lot of times it's hard for us to share that story when we're out doing the work of what our personal struggle is. So I just wanted to thank you for sharing.
Well, thank you for that. I want to say that I've spoken about this work for many years. It's because the Great Wall, for example, is 30 years old in its first segments. I only recently have begun to tell Fernando's story. The story of the central metaphor of that work I always extracted. And the reason I did that was because I was approaching an art world who would immediately identify me as a gang member. I became identified with the people that I made. I think actually there's something very, very interesting of the images that I make. I think that one of the things that we suffer with is that if we make work for poor people, or for people, gang members or community members, that the association with the people who we are making it for becomes very, very clear, and that the work becomes denigrated by virtue of its audience. And that is something that we need to really take a look at and begin to address. Because why is that the case? Why would you not consider this a higher art form? But I think it's really true. And the story that you wanted me to tell is a story about the thing about the creation of these big-scale digital images and the possibility of actually allowing people to actually mitigate what is the imagery. In other words, on the USC piece that I left you with is the final image. That work is drawn, and this is before the invention of the lab. And that work is like, sketches and blue lines and blueprints locked in stone by an art committee who's reviewed it. If I change anything in it, it would be a problem. But in the Gaddison work, I was painting for the Central American Research and Education Center. They were sponsoring it. They were engaged in the whole reclamation of the story. And the night before it was to go to print, and we had been laboring to get it done. And we were ready to get it out that next morning. And at 11 o'clock at night, my team and I were still working in the lab preparing for the print. And a huge scale, tremendous amounts of data was in the computer, and we were just praying it wouldn't crash, that we'd get it to the print, it was going to be done. And a knock came on the door. And I opened the door, and there was a wonderful woman, the director of the Central American Research and Education Center, whose name is Angela Zambrano. Many of you in Los Angeles know her for her work here and for her work with immigrants. I opened the door and she said, "Judy, you have to wait. I have something I have to tell you." I said, "Okay, come in, Angela." And so we sat down and she handed me a little Xerox, a tattered Xerox with an image of a woman on it. And she said, "You have to hold the presses because I had a dream." And the dream was about this person who was murdered during the war in El Salvador. She actually herself was very engaged as a fighter in the revolutionary forces there. And she said, she came to me in a dream, and we can't do this mural without her. So you have to put her in the mural. I don't care if we have to start over, we have to put her in the mural. So we sat there and we tried to figure out how she would appear. She was murdered in her classroom, she was a union organizer, and she is in the mural. And we found her as an apparition on one of the sites, and she fit nicely. It was almost as if the space was made for her. And when Angela was sawed in place, she said, "Okay, now I can sleep." So that's the degree to which people actually can be engaged with you in the process. Yes?
Since we're asking to tell the story. When I visited the lab in July,
Yeah.
you were finishing your work for the LA Hills Arts Project.
Oh, yes.
It's just another iteration of how art can live in those spaces. Would you maybe want to share that with this audience?
Well, we just finished a piece that I didn't show, and I didn't know exactly. I sort of, that would be such a fun thing to do, but it would have not. Yeah. Well, we were creating recently at Disney Hall. We produced a work called Medaka Throw, and I was collaborating with two other professors, José Luis Valenzuela and Steve Loza, both from UCLA, and we decided that we would try to commemorate the work of the great maestro David Alfaro Siqueiros, whose work is here in Alvera Street. It's actually, if you get moving around the town and you get down to Alvera Street, you can see the remnant of it above the Golondrina, the oldest Mexican restaurant in LA. And go have some cochinita. It's a really fabulous place. And above it is a piece of America Tropical. It was censored in 1931. And the central image is a figure crucified of a mestizo worker. And it's actually Siqueiros predicting, essentially, what is going to happen to the workers of Los Angeles. And, but he was told to paint a tropical America, a kind of beautiful Bavarian beer garden kind of piece. He sends away his workers last night, and then he puts this figure that is really the odious figure of a person who is an indigenous person on the cross. And there's an American eagle above him and from the dollar, and it's very clear what he's saying. And the city fathers immediately took exception to the piece and they whited it out. Within 1 year, it was completely destroyed. The Getty has been reviving that work. It's actually going to be open to the public again. You'll see what is left of it. There's not a tremendous amount left to it, but it's actually a really important work because it's perhaps the work that was the seat, the place that was the spirit, like a giant apparition in the 1970s. It started to appear through the whitewash. It began to be a piece that we said is calling us back, and here it is, the story, and many of us, particularly the Chicano muralists, began to see that work as a call to paint on our streets. We reproduced that piece in a digital file, repainted it. My colleague Marta Ramirez is here, who also studied with David Alfaro Siqueiros. And we recreated the piece, put it into a film, and to the Mexican Philharmonic, 175 performers, we produced a work on the story of America Tropical in visuals behind the Philharmonic in Disney Hall, which was kind of a glorious night and a really wonderful, we called it Mexican Night at Disney. It was quite an event. It was interesting because none of the typical public relations methods, you couldn't have gone online to Disney Hall and bought tickets because they didn't even list it, and yet it sold out. So it went through Mexican media, it went through the radio stations, it was packed, people couldn't get tickets, people were calling me at the last moment, and not through the regular media at all. It was a great lesson for us all, and we had a marvelous time. Steve Lossa wrote the sonic poem. Jose Luis brought Siqueiros to life on the stage with an actor who actually did this wonderful reading of his letters. And so the whole night became about this piece called Tropical America.
One last question.
One more.
It's a mini question though. So how did you put the research and development money before people saw it so that people could see it and they give you money to build it?
That's a big question, isn't it? Yeah, so I didn't. People don't give you research and development money. What you do is you inch out on ice and hope it doesn't crack. What you do is you actually begin to, with the research facility, I'm able to actually do experimentation, and with the university support, the structure is there in which I can do the basic work. It funds my key members of my staff and also the facility. Now, the problem, of course, is that when you're going to actually build something and you have to do a lot of research and development, trying to get people to put money into it in the public sector in advance is difficult. But we find that it's worth it in the end because it actually takes care of the problems in advance. You save yourself a lot of trouble by doing it all the way through. Gina.
Very briefly, how you responded and the lab was created in response to comments to some students who were on hunger strike in the 90s.
Yes, 1993.
So some of us have been having our conversations in this conference about what is the role of the university, how are those of us who work there, either as staff or as faculty, thinking about these kinds of community connections, what's our role, how much power we have, et cetera, et cetera. So can you talk a little bit about the hunger strike and how we were able to create this lab that then is the place, this research site where this can happen now and going forward, hopefully for a long time to come. But how it was that you described it as where your sense of activism with your work as a teacher, a professor, came together
Right.
in a way to make that happen.
Well, before that time, I was teaching, and my university would place me into, like, as a studio arts professor at UC Irvine, for example. I almost solely taught fundamental courses in painting and drawing, and I did not ever get to do any kind of community work. And every time I tried to infuse a community work, I could do that on top of my regular load, okay? And sometimes I still did it. I still took on a health clinic in Santa Ana and produced a series of work for it with my students. But it was not actually considered to be part of my work. With the hunger strike, I had a very key moment of negotiation power. This was a very, as I said, a very contentious battle. And even though our chancellor at the time was not disposed to revive Chicano studies, there were state legislators who were willing to withdraw money from the university. There were public officials that were very high profile that ended up in that encampment on the campus. There were many faculty that degraded and denigrated that activity and said that they thought that it was sort of abominable and that maybe Chicano studies shouldn't exist. But nevertheless, whatever your opinion on that particular action, what it did is it brought 6 new professors into that department. And in that department, part of the charge named for a union organizer, that it was completely within keeping to think of the possibility of an activist-based art approach because of the relationship historically between the artists and the movement. So for example, Cesar Chavez's movement was very deeply fueled and energized by the spirit of the arts, in theater and in music and in visual arts. So my reach to saying I wanted to do this kind of work was not that difficult. It was not as difficult as it might have been. And it's not to say that it could have happened if there hadn't been an enlightened dean, if there hadn't been a moment of time in which I could make that negotiation. And I basically played hardball. I said, I'm not coming unless I can have this space in the community, and I want to teach in this way. Now, what I want to do is, I just made it impossible for them. I said, I want a 24-hour lab. No, think of a university giving you a 24-hour lab. I don't want any surveillance cameras. I want a place in which we can cook and stay up all night. I want a place in which we can actually do a digital lab that isn't a traditional lab. We can move the computers around. They're not going to be stationary, right? So I want to be able to paint in that lab at the same time. So in other words, what I created was I made the circumstance. And then I said, well, I can do it, and I'm offered a community site. Could you allow that to occur? And then that's how we began to do it. And it's actually very close to the campus. So my students actually come off campus. It's really good for them to do that. They come into a lab that is set up for this kind of teaching, and they have a moment that is different, in which they're working in a collaborative team. It's signaled as a different space. And then they take on what I call the mission impossible. We have a community group. They would like for us to do a piece in 20 weeks. And it's a really hard place. It's a low-income housing project. It's one of the most violent housing projects in LA. We're going to look at the history of housing projects, and we have to put 6 pieces up, and they only have $4,000. And that's what we do. And so we were able to take those projects that we couldn't probably finance or support in any other way. And through that process, my students become the people who are activating the production, they're fueling the production, and they're trying to figure out how to stretch the little tiny dollars that they have to do it. Thank you.